When did your ex's perfect life come crashing down in the most satisfying way possible? I uncovered their disgusting affair at 7:45 a.m. on a rainy Sunday morning. I was looking for a pancake recipe on our shared family iPad and found a synchronized voice memo he'd accidentally recorded on his phone. He was supposedly at a regional cybersecurity summit in Denver. Instead, I listened to him and Elena giggling about the ocean view from their $2,500 a night resort balcony in Cabo San Lucas, clinking mimosa glasses. The fallout was catastrophic. He legally maneuvered his way out of our joint accounts, sticking me with a $42,000 home equity loan, and immediately moved into a sleek downtown penthouse with her. The real nightmare began during his mandatory custody weekends. Elena weaponized her commission checks to actively alienate my kids from me. She bought my 9-year-old son a $1,200 gaming PC, and my 11-year-old daughter an actual authentic Prada mini bag. They'd come home smelling like expensive department stores, casually mentioning how Elena says people who work hourly jobs just lack vision. She was trying to erase me by becoming their wealthy, cool ATM. When I confronted my ex about the wildly inappropriate gifts, he smugly told me to stop projecting my financial insecurities onto his generous partner. His sister even texted me after a school play, calling me a jealous hindrance who needed therapy. I swallowed my pride, working double shifts as a pediatric nurse, just counting the agonizing days until my kids were old enough to see the truth. 3 years into this suffocating hell, I attended a contentious city zoning board meeting in South Austin. A proposed commercial development threatened to bulldoze the community park near my cramped apartment. The guy leading the neighborhood opposition was articulate, sharp, and oddly familiar. We grabbed terrible diner coffee afterward to discuss strategy. At exactly 10:30 p.m., while he was pulling up a zoning map on his laptop, a photo of a very specific golden retriever with a white patch over its left eye popped up on his desktop. I froze. I knew that dog from my kids' weekend photos. His name was Marcus. He was the prominent commercial architect Elena had brutally discarded 5 years ago during her eat, pray, love phase. My former sister-in-law had once gossiped that Elena still drunkenly stalked Marcus's LinkedIn, deeply regretting losing the only man who truly challenged her intellect instead of just funding her lifestyle. Marcus and I bonded over the zoning fight, but it quickly turned into late-night phone calls about everything but our toxic exes. He rebuilt my shattered confidence brick by brick. 8 months later, we were completely inseparable. To be crystal clear, his history with Elena was just a bizarre cosmic joke. I fell for Marcus because he happily helped my son build a papier-mâché volcano for the science fair at midnight, and never once made me feel small. Last November, he proposed in my tiny kitchen. We kept our relationship completely off social media, but last month, my ex's tech company went totally under following a massive embezzlement scandal. His accounts were frozen by the SEC. Within weeks, the penthouse went into default, and my ex was facing federal indictments. Elena panicked. Yesterday afternoon, Marcus showed me a frantic email he'd just received at his architectural firm. It was Elena. She was begging Marcus for a $150,000 bridge loan to secure a defense lawyer, claiming she had made a terrible mistake leaving him all those years ago and desperately needed a lifeline. She explicitly wrote, "You're the only man I've ever truly respected." Marcus didn't reply to her. Instead, he simply forwarded the desperate email to my ex's defense attorney. We didn't throw a public fit, and we didn't scream at her. We let the crumbling walls do the talking. Today, at 2 p.m. sharp, Marcus and I attended a foreclosure auction at the county courthouse. We placed the winning bid on Elena's prized downtown penthouse, the exact same one she paraded my kids around in to make me feel worthless. Next Thursday, she legally has to hand over the physical keys to the new owners. She has absolutely no idea it's us. I cannot wait to see the look on her face when she realizes the woman she called a financial insecurity now holds the deed to her shattered life, standing right next to the one man she couldn't buy back. The courthouse steps were slick, with the same kind of drizzling rain that had been falling the morning I found that voice memo. Marcus squeezed my hand as we walked toward his car, the deed paperwork tucked into a plain manila envelope under his arm. I looked at the time on my phone, 2:45 p.m. In almost exactly 3 years, my life had done a complete 180-degree turn, but the gravity of it hadn't really sunk in until I saw the auctioneer's gavel hit the block. When my ex David first left, he didn't just walk away, he scorched the earth. He knew I'd never walk away from the kids, so he used the home equity loan as a leash. I remember sitting at my kitchen table 3 years ago, staring at a stack of bills and a notice from the bank while the kids were away at the Glass Palace, which is what I called the penthouse in my head. They'd come back talking about the heated floors and the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the frost-covered city. My son, Leo, would complain that my car smelled like old French fries compared to Elena's new Range Rover. Every comment was a tiny serrated blade. I didn't tell Marcus about the auction until 48 hours before it happened. We were sitting in his living room, a space that felt like a real home, filled with books and blueprints and the smell of actual cedar, and he just looked at me and said, "You know she's going to lose it, right? The bank isn't giving them another inch." "I know," I said. I looked up the filing. It's scheduled for Thursday. Marcus didn't hesitate. He's a man of action, the kind who measures twice and cuts once. He had the liquidity from a major commercial project he'd just wrapped up in North Dallas, and I had the savings I'd been hoarding like a squirrel, plus the equity from selling my small place. We'd talked about buying a house together, something with a big yard for Marcus, the dog, and the kids, but this was different. This was visceral. The drive to the penthouse on Keyover Day was silent. I wore my best coat, a deep navy wool, one I'd saved for, and I kept my hair down. I wanted to look exactly like the woman she'd spent 3 years trying to convince my children was a low-vision failure. Marcus parked the car a block away. We walked up to the lobby of the building where the doorman, a guy named Jorge, who had seen me pick up my crying kids 100 times at the curb, blinked in surprise. "Heading up to 42B, Jorge," Marcus said, showing the legal transfer documents. Jorge's eyebrows shot up, but he just nodded and buzzled us through. The elevator ride felt like it took an hour. When the doors opened directly into the foyer of the penthouse, the air hit me first. It smelled like expensive candles and desperation. The place was a disaster. Cardboard boxes were half-taped and scattered across the white marble floor. Elena was standing by the window, her back to us, barking into her phone. She sounded frayed, her voice hitting a pitch I'd never heard before. "I told you, the wire hasn't hit. If Marcus doesn't..." She stopped mid-sentence as she turned around and saw us. The silence that followed was heavy. She didn't see me at first. Her eyes locked onto Marcus. Her face went through a terrifying transformation from rage to a flickering, pathetic hope, and then finally to a bone-deep confusion. She actually took a step toward toward him, dropping her phone onto a velvet ottoman. Marcus? She whispered. You got my email? I knew you'd come. I knew you wouldn't let them do this. She still hadn't looked at me. To her, I was just a ghost, or maybe an assistant. Marcus didn't move. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, his expression completely neutral. I got the email, Elena, Marcus said. His voice was calm, the way he talks when he's explaining a structural flaw in a building. But I think you're mistaken. I'm not here to give you a loan. Elena blinked, her gaze finally shifting to me. She looked at my face, then back to Marcus, then down at the manila envelope in his hand. I saw the moment the gears finally turned. I saw the moment she realized I wasn't there for a custody handoff. What is she doing here? Elena snapped, the old venom returning for a split second before her voice wavered. This is a private matter, Marcus. I'm losing my home. Actually, I said, stepping forward. I felt remarkably steady. No heart racing, no shaking hands. You've already lost it, and it isn't your home anymore. It's ours. I held out my hand. The keys, Elena. It's 2-5. Legally, you're trespassing. The color drained from her face so fast, I thought she might actually faint onto her white rug. She looked at Marcus, her eyes wide and searching for some kind of gotcha, or a sign that this was a cruel joke. You're with Times Her? She stammered, pointing a manicured finger at me. You're buying this. For Times Her? I'm buying it with her, Marcus corrected. As an investment. We're thinking of turning it into a rental property. Or maybe just keeping it for when the kids want to stay in the city. They've always liked the view, right? He looked at me and smiled, a genuine warm smile that made Elena's jaw tighten until I thought it might snap. She looked around the room where she'd sat my daughter down and told her that her mother didn't understand the finer things, the room where she'd fed my son steak and told him that his mother's cooking was poverty food. She didn't have a comeback. For the first time in the 3 years I'd known of her existence, Elena was speechless. She reached into her bag, pulled out a heavy brass keyring, and literally threw it at the floor. It skidded across the marble, coming to a rest at my feet. You're both disgusting, she spat, though it lacked any real heat. She was shaking. She grabbed a small designer suitcase, the only thing she had left packed, it seemed, and marched toward the elevator. As the doors began to close, I called out one last thing. Oh, Elena, tell David his sister's therapy suggestion really worked wonders for my confidence. I'll send her a thank you note from the new address. The doors slid shut on her face. Marcus and I stood in the middle of the empty, echoing penthouse. It was a beautiful space, but it felt cold. He walked over, picked up the keys, and dropped them into my palm. You okay? He asked. Better than okay, I said. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the street. I could see her Range Rover, the one that was likely next on the repossession list, pulling away from the curb. The kids were staying with me full-time now. David was too busy meeting with public defenders to worry about weekend visits, and Elena had already scrubbed him from her social media, though it didn't matter. Her perfect life was a house of cards, and I hadn't even had to blow it down. I just had to wait for the wind to change. That evening, I brought the kids over. I didn't tell them we bought it at first. I just told them we were stopping by to pick up some things their dad had left behind. When we walked in, my daughter Maya looked around at the boxes and the bare walls. Is Elena moving? She asked, her voice small. She's gone, honey, I said, and so is your dad's company. Leo wandered over to the spot where his gaming PC used to sit. It was gone. Elena had likely sold it for quick cash weeks ago. He looked disappointed, but then he looked at Marcus, who was leaning against the kitchen island. Hey, Leo, Marcus said. I was thinking, this place is okay, but it's a bit stiff, don't you think? I know a great spot in the hill country with a yard big enough for a real workshop. What do you think about building a real volcano out there? One with actual chemicals, not just baking soda? Leo's face lit up. The Prada bag Maya was holding, the one she'd been carrying like a shield, suddenly looked heavy and ridiculous in this empty, failing room. She set it down on a box. Can we go home now? She asked, looking at me. To our real home? I missed the smell of the pancakes. I hugged her, burying my face in her hair. Yeah, I whispered. Let's go home. As we walked out, I didn't look back at the penthouse. I had the deed. I had the keys. But more importantly, I had the quiet, heavy knowledge that while they were busy trying to buy my children, I was busy building a life they could never afford. The pancake batter was still sitting in a ceramic bowl on the counter when I walked back into my kitchen that Monday morning. It had separated into a thick, yellowish silt at the bottom and a watery film on top. I stared at it for a long time. I hadn't been able to make breakfast after the keys were handed over. We'd just grabbed some greasy fast food on the way home because the kids were quiet and I was vibrating with a nervous energy that felt like static under my skin. I dumped the bowl into the sink and watched the gray water swirl down the drain. The silence in my apartment was different now. For 3 years, it had been a heavy, defensive silence, the kind you maintain when you're waiting for the next legal threat or the next text message from an ex-sister-in-law telling you what a failure you are. Now, the silence felt like a clean slate. I went to work at the hospital at 6:30 a.m. the following Tuesday. I'm a pediatric nurse in the oncology ward. You see things there that make the drama of a cheating husband feel like a paper cut, but that doesn't mean the paper cut doesn't sting when you're trying to hold it together for a 6-year-old in a hospital bed. My coworkers knew parts of the story. They'd seen me taking frantic calls in the break room or crying in the supply closet when the home equity loan interest hiked up. You look different, Sarah, the head nurse said as we were charting. She didn't mean my hair or my scrubs. She meant my shoulders. They weren't up around my ears for the first time since 2023. I bought a house, I said. It felt weird to call it that. It was a penthouse, a trophy of a life built on lies. But to me, it was just a piece of paper that proved I still existed. With Marcus? She asked, smiling. With Marcus. The fallout from the foreclosure didn't take long to reach the social circles I'd been exiled from. By Wednesday, my phone started doing that low, rhythmic buzz that usually signaled a group chat I'd been blocked from, was suddenly leaking. It was a DM from an old friend, someone who had gone Team David the second the penthouse party started. Is it true? She wrote. I heard Elena is staying at a budget motel off I-35, and that you were at the auction. People are saying Marcus bought it for you out of spite. That's a bit much, don't you think? I didn't reply. I deleted the message and blocked her. 3 years ago, I would have typed out a 3-paragraph defense, citing the $42,000 loan and the parental alienation. Now, I just felt a cold, clinical indifference. I had a patient in room 402 who needed a fresh IV line and a distraction from the fact that he was losing his hair. The budget motel drama felt like news from a different planet. Thursday was the day Marcus and I had agreed to go back to the penthouse to change the locks. We met in the lobby. He had a heavy-duty toolbox in one hand and a bag of takeout Thai food in the other. Ready to reclaim the fortress? He asked. The penthouse felt even more hollow than it had on key day. The movers had come and gone, taking the furniture that hadn't been seized. There were rectangular ghosts on the walls where expensive art used to hang. I walked through the rooms, listening to the tap 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 of Marcus's hammer as he replaced the deadbolt on the front door. I wandered into the master bedroom. This was the room David had bragged about in those early voice memos. The view from the bed is insane, he'd whispered into his phone while I was at home changing a diaper with a fever. I stood where the bed used to be. The carpet was indented, 4 heavy squares marking where their king-sized mattress had sat. I looked at the view. The Austin skyline was glowing, all glass and ambition. It was beautiful, but it felt like a trap. This place was built on the idea that you are only as valuable as the things you own. Elena had tried to teach my children that lesson, and it had almost worked. Hey, Marcus said, leaning against the doorframe. He'd finished the lock. You're thinking about the kids. I'm thinking about how much I want to rip this carpet up, I said, and how much I don't want to live here. Marcus walked over and put his arm around me. We don't have to. We'll flip it. The market is insane right now. We sell this, pay off your debt, put the rest in a trust for Leo and Maya, and find that house with the yard, the one with the workshop. You'd do that? I asked. I don't want to live in her regrets, he said. I want to live in our future. We were sitting on the floor of the empty living room eating pad thai out of plastic containers when my phone rang. It was David. Not a text, an actual call. I hadn't spoken to his voice in months. All our communication went through a court-mandated app. I put it on speaker. What do you want, David? His voice was thin. The smug, cybersecurity genius vibrato was gone. He sounded like a man who had spent 48 hours realizing that the SEC doesn't care about your vision. I need you to talk to the kids, he said. They aren't answering my texts. Maya blocked me. Leo won't pick up. They're kids, David. They saw their dad's face on a news segment about embezzlement. They saw Elena get kicked out of their weekend home. What do you expect? I expect you not to poison them. He suddenly flared up, a flash of the old David. I know you're behind this. I know about the auction. Marcus told his sister, and she told mine. You think you're so clever, buying that place. It's pathetic. It's obsessed. I'm not the one who emailed Marcus begging for $150,000, David. That was your partner. The silence on the other end was absolute. He didn't know. Elena hadn't told him she'd tried to crawl back to her ex for a bridge loan while David was facing federal charges. She wouldn't do that, he whispered. But the conviction was gone. She did. Marcus has the email. We forwarded it to your lawyer, actually. We figured he'd want to know about her trying to secure side funding without disclosing it. Transparency is important in a legal defense, right? You're destroying me, he said, his voice breaking. No, I said, looking at the city lights. You did that at 7:45 a.m. on a rainy Sunday. I'm just the one holding the invoice. I hung up. Marcus reached over and took my hand. You okay? Yeah, I said. I really am. We spent the rest of the night planning the renovation. Not for us, but for the next person who would live here. Someone who would hopefully fill the rooms with something other than spite and expensive perfume. 2 weeks later, the for sale sign went up. The listing photos were crisp and professional, but if you looked closely at the reflection in the master bedroom window, you could see a tiny sliver of a golden retriever with a white patch over his eye, sitting patiently by the door. The day the penthouse sold for $300,000 more than we paid at auction, I took the kids out to the property Marcus had found in Dripping Springs. It was 5 acres of cedar trees and limestone. There was an old ranch house on it that needed a new roof and a lot of love, but the backyard ended at a creek that ran clear and cold. Leo ran straight for the water. Maya stood on the porch, looking at the trees. She wasn't holding her Prada bag. She was wearing a pair of old sneakers and a t-shirt stained with blue paint from an art project. Is this the new place? She asked. If you guys like it, I said. She looked at Marcus, who was already down by the creek with Leo, showing him how to skip stones. It doesn't have heated floors, Maya said, a small smile playing on her lips. No, I said, but it has a really big kitchen for pancakes. She hugged me then, a real, bone-crushing kid hug that I hadn't felt in years. The smell of department stores was gone. She just smelled like sunshine and cedar. The closing process on the Dripping Springs house took 30 days. 30 days of living in boxes in my cramped apartment while the for sale sign on the penthouse drew in offers from people who wanted to buy a lifestyle that had already rotted from the inside out. I didn't care about the profit margin, although Marcus insisted on showing me the spreadsheets. He wanted me to see the numbers because he knew that for years, David had used math as a weapon to make me feel small. You're an equal partner in this, Marcus said one evening, sliding a laptop toward me. The sale of the penthouse clears your debt, pays for the new roof on the ranch, and leaves enough for the kids' college funds to be fully vested. You aren't surviving anymore. You're set. I looked at the screen. The home equity loan that $42,000 anchored David had chained to my neck was highlighted in red. With one click, Marcus showed me how it disappeared. I felt a phantom weight lift off my chest, a pressure I'd carried for over 1,000 days. The move to the ranch happened on a Saturday. No movers this time. Just Marcus, his brother, and me. We hauled my old IKEA dresser and the kids' mismatched beds into the house that smelled like cedar and potential. My son, Leo, spent the entire day in the creek. He came back to the porch at dusk, his jeans soaked to the knees and a jar full of minnows in his hand. He didn't ask about his gaming PC once. He didn't ask when we were going back to the Glass Palace. He just asked if we could get a goat. Life slowed down, but the world outside didn't stop spinning. David's legal troubles hit the local news again 3 months later. The embezzlement wasn't just corporate greed. It was a desperate, messy attempt to fund the life Elena demanded. He'd been skimming from client escrow accounts to pay for those $2,500 a night Cabo trips and the Prada bags. He took a plea deal, 18 months in a federal minimum security facility and 10 years of probation. I found out through a formal letter from his attorney. David wanted to see the kids before he went away. I didn't block him this time. I sat the kids down on the back porch of the ranch. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the limestone. I told them the truth, minus the ugly details of the affair. I told them their dad had made bad choices with work and money, and he had to go away for a while to take responsibility. Do we have to go? Maya asked. She was braiding a piece of twine she'd found in the barn. She looked older than 11. The city girl veneer Elena had tried to paint over her had peeled away, leaving something tougher and more grounded. Only if you want to, I said. They decided to go. One visit. I drove them to a sterile beige office building in North Austin where the supervised visitation took place. I stayed in the car. I watched them walk through the glass doors, 2 kids who had seen way too much in 3 years. Marcus sat in the passenger seat next to me, his hand resting on the back of my neck. He didn't say it'll be fine. He knew it wouldn't be fine. It would just be over. An hour later, they walked back out. Leo looked bored. Maya looked relieved. When they climbed into the back seat, the silence lasted for 3 blocks. He looks small, Leo finally said, staring out the window at a passing construction site, and he kept asking asking about the penthouse. He didn't even ask about my soccer game. He asked me if I still had the bag, Maya whispered. The Prada one. I told him I left it in the closet of the place Elena lost. He got really quiet after that. That was the last time they saw him for a long time. David went to prison, and Elena disappeared into the cracks of the city. I heard through a nurse at the hospital that she'd tried to sue David for emotional distress to get a piece of his remaining assets, but there was nothing left to take. She had hitched her wagon to a man who stole to keep her, and when the stealing stopped, so did the love. The final piece of justice came in the mail 6 months after we moved. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope addressed to me. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note from David's sister, the one who had called me a jealous hindrance and told me I needed therapy. I saw the news about the house in Dripping Springs, it read, and I saw the SEC filings. I didn't know Sarah. David told us you were the one who emptied the accounts. He told us you were unstable. I should have listened to you when you tried to tell me about Cabo. I'm sorry doesn't cover it, but for what it's worth, the kids look happy in the photos I see online. You were always the strong one. I was just too blind to see which side was actually winning. I read it twice. I thought about the nights I'd spent shaking with rage at her texts. I thought about the therapy I actually did times go to, not because I was a hindrance, but because I had to rebuild a soul that had been dismantled by experts. I didn't write back. Some apologies are just more weight for the person who's already finished the climb. I walked over to the fireplace in our living room, the one Marcus had helped me restore, and I dropped the letter onto the glowing embers. I watched the cream-colored paper curl and turn black, the "I'm sorry" disappearing into the heat. Marcus walked in then, smelling like sawdust in the outdoors. He had a smudge of dirt on his cheek and a look of absolute peace in his eyes. He didn't ask what I was burning. He just pulled me into his arms, and we stood there in the quiet of our home, listening to the sound of the wind in the cedars and the distant laughter of my children in the creek. The silence that followed the burning of that letter felt like the final installment of a debt I didn't even know I still owed. I stood by the fireplace in the ranch house for a long time, watching the gray ash of my former sister-in-law's apology flake away. It was funny. For years, I had rehearsed what I would say if any of them ever realized they were wrong. I had entire speeches ready about the pediatric nurse who worked 6 zero-hour weeks while they were sipping champagne on a stolen dime. But now that the apology was here, I didn't want to say anything. I just wanted to go to bed in a house that didn't have any hidden voice memos or synchronized iPads. The next few months were a blur of actual quiet labor. Marcus and I didn't just buy the ranch. We lived in it. There's a specific kind of peace that comes with fixing things that are actually broken, like a leaky pipe or a sagging porch, instead of trying to fix people who are fundamentally hollow. We spent our Saturdays at the local hardware store. I traded my Prada-scented nightmares for the smell of sawdust, joint compound, and the humid, earthy scent of the Texas hill country after a thunderstorm. I remember a Tuesday in July, about 4 months after David started his sentence. I was at the hospital, finishing a double shift. My feet ached in that specific way only nurses understand, a dull, thrumming heat that starts in the arches and radiates up to the knees. I was walking to my car when I saw a woman standing near the bus stop outside the main entrance. She was wearing a trench coat that was too heavy for the Texas heat and carrying a bag that looked familiar. It was Elena. She didn't see me at first. She looked smaller, thinner. The visionary glow was gone, replaced by the pinched gray look of someone who spends a lot of time calculating exactly how many miles they can get out of a gallon of gas. Her hair, which used to be a $400 a month masterpiece of honey-colored highlights, was dark at the roots and frizzy. She was staring at a bus schedule like it was written in a language she didn't understand. I could have kept walking. I could have gotten into my car and driven home to my 5 acres and my architect husband and my kids, but I found my feet moving toward her. It wasn't out of kindness and it wasn't out of malice. It was curiosity. I wanted to see if the monster still had teeth. The 801 doesn't come for another 20 minutes, I said, stopping a few feet away. She jumped, her head snapping up. When she recognized me, I saw a flash of the old Elena, that sharp, defensive sneer, but it flickered out almost instantly. She didn't have the energy to sustain it. She looked at my scrubs, my badge, and then at the keys in my hand. "Sarah," she said. Her voice was raspy. "What are you doing here? Come to gloat some more?" "I work here, Elena. I've worked here for 10 years. This is the hourly job you told my kids lacked vision." She looked away, her jaw tight. "Everything is tied up in the courts. David's lawyers are vultures. They took my car. They took everything that wasn't nailed down in that penthouse. I'm staying with a cousin in Round Rock. The budget motel didn't work out?" She winced. "I made a mistake. I followed a man who promised me the world." "No," I said, stepping closer. "You followed a man who promised you times my times world. You didn't care where the money came from as long as the labels were right. You tried to buy my children. That wasn't a mistake, Elena. That was a choice." She didn't say anything. She just gripped the strap of her bag, a knockoff. I realized. Not even a real one this time. The bus pulled up, hissing as the doors opened. She stepped toward it, then paused and looked back at me. "Is Marcus? Is he happy?" I thought about Marcus. I thought about him sitting on the floor with my daughter, helping her map out a garden for the spring. I thought about the way he looks at me when I come home from a long shift, like I'm the only thing in the room that matters. "He's at peace," I said. "There's a difference." She got on the bus without another word. I watched it pull away into the Austin traffic, a cloud of diesel exhaust lingering where she had stood. I felt nothing. No surge of triumph, no lingering anger, just the profound realization that the woman who had nearly destroyed my life was now just a person waiting for a bus. When I got home that night, Marcus was in the kitchen. He had a glass of wine waiting for me and a map of the back acreage spread out on the table. "I found a spot for the workshop," he said, pulling me into his side. "It's near the creek, under those 2 big live oaks. We can build it out of reclaimed wood from the old barn." I leaned my head against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of him. "I saw her today, Elena, at the bus stop." He went still for a second, then relaxed. And I realized I don't care anymore. Not about the money she spent, or the things she said, or the house we took back. I just wanted to come home to you. He kissed the top of my head. "Good, because I've been thinking about those goats Leo wants." I found a breeder in Wimberley. The rest of the year passed with a quiet, steady rhythm. We sold the penthouse for a massive profit, exactly as Marcus predicted. I used my half to pay off every cent of debt I had ever accrued. I set up the college funds. And then, I did something I hadn't done in years. I took a vacation. Not a $2,500 a night resort in Cabo, but a cabin in the mountains of New Mexico. Just me, Marcus, and the kids. We hiked until our legs were jelly. We cooked over a fire. One night, sitting under a sky so full of stars it looked like spilled salt, my son Leo looked at me. "Mom? Yeah, buddy? I'm glad we don't have that big TV anymore. The one at the penthouse." "Why's that?" "Because you're not always in the other room crying when we're we're watching it, he said simply. I felt a lump in my throat that I couldn't swallow. I looked at Marcus, who was staring into the fire, his hand resting on Leo's shoulder. He didn't say anything, but he squeezed my hand under the blanket. The kids eventually fell asleep in their sleeping bags, and it was just Marcus and me in the cold mountain air. You did it, Sarah, he whispered. You got them back. We did it, I corrected. No, you held the line. I just helped you build the fence. We moved into the ranch full-time that winter. The transition from victim of a scandal to woman who lives in the country was complete. People in town didn't know about the embezzlement or the penthouse or the woman at the bus stop. They just knew me as the nurse who was good with stitches and the guy who was rebuilding the old Miller place. David called from prison on Christmas Eve. It was a collect call. I accepted it because the kids were in the room and I wanted them to know I wasn't afraid of his voice anymore. He sounded old. He talked about the food and the cold and how he missed the way things used to be. He didn't ask about the ranch. He didn't ask how I was doing. He just talked about himself. A monologue of self-pity that lasted exactly 15 minutes until the automated system cut him off. When the line went dead, I handed the phone to Maya. You okay? I asked. She nodded, her expression neutral. He's just a man in a room, Mom. He's not the king of anything anymore. She went back to opening her presents, and I realized she was right. We had stripped them of their power, not by fighting them, but by outlasting them. We had built a life that was so big and so real that there was no room left for their ghost stories. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun was hitting the frost on the cedar trees, turning the whole world into silver. I walked out onto the porch with a cup of coffee. The goats were bleating in the distance, and I could hear Marcus moving around in the kitchen, probably starting the first batch of Christmas pancakes. I looked down at my hands. They were the hands of a nurse, a mother, and a woman who owned her own land. There was no Prada bag in sight, and I had never felt wealthier in my entire life. The rainy Sunday morning in 2023 felt like a lifetime ago. A different woman's life, a different woman's pain. I didn't even notice Marcus had come out onto the porch until I felt the heat of a fresh mug of coffee being pressed into my other hand. He didn't say good morning. He just leaned his hip against the railing and looked out at the same frost I was staring at. That's the thing about him, he knows when a moment needs words and when it just needs weight. The appraiser is coming by at 11, he said, his voice low so as not to wake the kids. For the workshop permits. You want to be here for that, or are you heading into the unit? I'll be here, I said. I'm not trading this view for a hospital hallway today. I called in for a personal day. He raised an eyebrow. I never called in. I was the person who showed up with a 101-degree fever because the floor was short-staffed. But looking at the way the light was hitting the limestone, I realized I didn't owe the world my exhaustion anymore. By 10 a.m., the kids were up and the house was loud. It was a good kind of loud. The sound of a Lego bin being dumped out and the dog barking at a squirrel. I was clearing the breakfast plates when a car I didn't recognize pulled up the long gravel driveway. It wasn't the appraiser's truck. It was a silver sedan, dusty and dented, looking completely out of place against the backdrop of the ranch. My heart did a familiar, unpleasant stutter. I looked at Marcus. He was already at the door, his hand on the frame. A woman got out. It wasn't Elena. It was David's mother, Evelyn. I hadn't seen her since the deposition. She had sat on the other side of a mahogany table and watched her son's lawyer tear into my character, saying nothing as they suggested my work schedule was the reason David sought comfort elsewhere. She looked older. Her expensive highlights had grown out into a dull, flat gray, and her designer coat looked heavy on her frail frame. Marcus looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. Do you want her here? I took a breath and stepped out onto the porch. Evelyn. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs, clutching her handbag like a shield. She didn't look at Marcus. She looked at me, and then her eyes drifted to the kids, who were peering through the screen door. Sarah, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't know where else to go. The house. The bank took the house in Westlake. David put it up as collateral for one of his ventures I didn't know about. I have 48 hours to vacate. I felt a cold wave of realization. David hadn't just ruined me, and he hadn't just ruined himself. He had cannibalized his own mother's retirement to keep Elena in Prada. Why are you here, Evelyn? I asked. My voice was flatter than I expected. I thought I'd feel pity, but all I felt was the memory of her silence in that deposition room. I have nowhere to go, she whispered. My daughter won't take me in. She says her husband won't allow the drama near their kids. I thought, for the sake of your children, for their grandmother. I looked at her. I thought about the $42,000 loan. I thought about the nights I sat in the dark counting pennies while she was hosting dinner parties for David and his new partner. For the sake of my children, I said, you should have spoken up 3 years ago. You knew he was in Cabo. You knew he was using the home equity. You stayed quiet because you liked the penthouse. You liked the status he was buying with my life. I was wrong, she sobbed, finally breaking. I was so wrong, Sarah. Please, just a few weeks until I find a senior apartment. Marcus stepped forward then. I thought he was going to tell her to leave, but he just looked at me. He was leaving the choice entirely to me. This was my house. This was my life. I looked at the woman who had watched me become a mother, and then watched me become a target. I saw the desperation in her eyes, the same desperation I'd felt on that rainy Sunday morning. But there was a difference. I had built a way out. She was just looking for someone else to pay the bill. There's a small guest cottage at the back of the property, I said. It hasn't been renovated. There's no heat yet, just a wood stove, and the roof leaks a little in the corner. You can stay there for 2 weeks. Not in the main house, not near the kids unless I'm present. She looked like she wanted to hug me, but I stepped back. 2 weeks, Evelyn, and then you're gone. I'm not your safety net. I'm just the person who remembers what it's like to have nothing. She nodded frantically and went back to her car to get her bags. Marcus waited until she was out of earshot. You're a better person than I am, he said quietly. No, I said, watching her struggle with a heavy suitcase. I just want her to see exactly what she threw away. I want her to see how happy we are without their money. The next 2 weeks were a strange, tense exercise in boundaries. Evelyn stayed in the cottage. She tried to come to the main house for coffee the first morning, but I met her on the porch and handed her a thermos. The cottage has a kitchenette, I told her. Use it. She saw the kids from a distance. She saw Leo helping Marcus clear brush. She saw Maya reading on the porch swing. She saw a life that was quiet and sturdy and real. One afternoon, I caught her standing by the fence, watching Marcus show Leo how to check the oil in the tractor. She was crying, but she didn't make a sound. She realized then, I think, that David hadn't just lost his freedom. He'd lost his legacy. He traded the respect of his son for the temporary approval of a woman who was currently riding a bus in Round Rock. On her final day, I drove her to the senior living facility she'd finally secured with the last of her savings. We sat in the car in the parking lot for a moment. He calls me from the prison, she said, her voice small. He asks for money. He says it's dangerous in there without it. What do you tell him? I asked. I tell him I don't have any, she said. And then I tell him him he should have stayed with the nurse. I put the car in gear. It wouldn't have mattered, Evelyn. He was always going to be this person. The nurse just happened to be the one who survived him. I drove back to the ranch alone. The sun was setting, and the sky was a bruised purple and orange. As I turned into the driveway, I saw the lights in the main house. They were warm and bright, a beacon in the dark. I parked the car and walked into the kitchen. Marcus was there, covered in dust from the workshop project, and the kids were arguing over what movie to watch. It was normal. It was boring. It was the most expensive thing I had ever owned. I sat down at the table and opened my laptop. I had a message from my lawyer. The final settlement from the penthouse sale had cleared. The last of the legal ties to David were severed. I looked at the balance in the account. It was a lot of zeros. But as I looked up at Marcus, who was currently trying to convince the dog to move off his favorite chair, I realized the money was just numbers. The real win was the fact that I didn't have to look over my shoulder anymore. The monsters weren't under the bed. They weren't in the penthouse. They were exactly where they belonged in the rearview mirror, fading into the distance while I drove toward the light.